only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Seminary Education, Preparing Future Faith Leaders to Respond to Intimate Partner Violence and Sexual Assault. I'll introduce our presenters in just a moment, but first we're going to go over some technical information. First, you should be able to hear me through your computer or phone as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please make sure that your headset or speakers are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, I recommend you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then try to connect again that way. All audience members are muted throughout the presentation. If you have comments or questions, you can submit them to me using the question box in the right side of your screen, and we'd love to hear from you. So you can submit your questions anytime during the presentation. I'll hold on to them until we get to the Q&A section of the presentation. We'll have about 15 minutes to take your questions and respond to them. If you don't see the question box on your screen, you should see a small orange arrow. So if you just click on that, that will open up more features for you to use. The slides you see on the screen will be emailed to you as a PDF later this afternoon, so you'll have them as a resource. And lastly, we're recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who can't join the live session. So we welcome people from the future listening. We want to thank the In Faith Community Foundation for sponsoring today's discussion. In Faith has sponsored a series of 12 in this year. They're a national charity with a mission to serve donors, spread joy, and change lives. This series of webinars is part of their Ending Family Violence initiative. They've sponsored dozens of webinars in the past few years, and you can find recordings of many of those on our website. You can visit infaithfound.org to find out more about the great work that they're doing, and we thank them for their sponsorship and their commitment. We have two presenters today, Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune and Dr. Nancy Nienhuis. Let me just briefly introduce them. Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune is the founder and senior analyst at Faith Trust Institute. She's been central to the ongoing movement with both faith communities and secular advocates in addressing domestic and sexual violence and abuse. Her books are widely read and considered foundational references in the field. And Dr. Nancy Nienhuis is the Dean of Campus Life and Vice President of Operations, Professor of Theology and Social Justice at Andover Newton Theological School. She has a doctorate in religion, gender, and culture from Harvard University. Her articles have appeared in the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion, Journal of Pastoral Care, the Journal of Religion and Abuse, and in Sojourners. And we're going to start this conversation, but audience members, I want to remind you that you can send in your questions anytime. And Marie, are you there?
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you, Nancy, for joining me for this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. Good. But before we get going, we'd like to know who you are out there listening today. And so we're going to do a quick poll. If you would take a moment to indicate on your screen. Because we're very interested to know who is wants to be a part of this conversation. Okay. So we have clergy and students. Very good. We don't have faculty here, and so Nancy and I will talk about that, I'm sure. But that's great. Thank you very much for being a part of this discussion, and we do welcome your comments and questions at any point. Feel free to jump into the discussion. So looking at the big picture, these statistics are the most current ones that we have, and what they tell us, which is probably no surprise to anyone today, is that sexual and domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual assault are disturbingly common, particularly for women, but also for men. And so part of the question that we face in our work within faith communities around these issues is, how can something that is so common as this be so under-addressed in our faith communities. And that's always the challenge as we try to do this work within various faith settings. So Nancy, do you have any observation on the general statistics you'd like to share?
You know, one of the things that this tells us, when you look at these numbers, and they're very consistent with studies that have been done over time, and in fact the CDC of the government has published major studies for years, so it's a great resource if you're looking for more information. But what these numbers tell us is that there's nowhere we can be where we don't have survivors and abusers with us. So that means that no matter what sermon you're preaching to survivors and abusers. No matter who's in your class as a student, you have some people who are survivors and you probably have some people who are abusers. So this is a problem that we don't walk in and out of. It's the one that's around us all the time.
Right. And often hidden in the process.
Mostly hidden, yes.
Yeah. So let's go to the next slide. Again, more data for us. So this is the study from IMA World Health and Sojourners a couple years ago, looking at faith leaders and finding that 74% underestimate the level of violence that's going on in their congregations, and 2 out of 3 speak at least once a year or not that often when they address the issue. I actually was pleased when I read this study to see that 2 out of 3 spoke at all once a year. And so I think that, but that was pretty much the limit to it. So I think part of what this study reminds us is how much work there is still to be done in terms of preparing faith leaders, particularly clergy in leadership roles, to address these issues. And one of the other things that came out of the study was that people said that if they didn't feel prepared, and if they were prepared, they would feel more comfortable in taking leadership on these issues. So that's always a reminder to those of us who are trying to do education and training around these issues, how important it is to do that not only in the seminary, but after the seminary as well.
Absolutely.
Nancy, any other thoughts on this one?
Well, I also was pleased to see that 2 out of 3 talk maybe once or less about the issue during the course of the year. Although I have to say, over the many years I've been teaching a class on domestic violence, I'd say 99% of the students in the class, I always ask the first day, have any of you heard a sermon on domestic violence? And these are people who grew up in the church and are, focused on becoming clergy. And it's rare that anyone has actually heard a sermon. So I want to know where these pastors are.
Right.
But I'm glad that, in this study, people said that. I suspect that in some areas the numbers are actually lower.
I think you're right. And the other part of the study that we really need, the data we need, is asking the laity, have you heard those sermons, and have they been helpful? So right. It's taking the research a little further to get the full picture of what's going on out there. So let's go to the next slide. These are the questions that Nancy and I are going to be discussing, just to give you an outline of where we want to take the discussion today. Congregations, but also the issue of culture. What are the practical tools and knowledge we should be teaching, and what are the challenges to integrating these issues in theological education? So let's begin with the why is it important? Nancy, I wanted to ask you, because you're one of the first people that I ever met who had begun to teach in this area, and you currently, as I understand it, offer a full course in the curriculum. So my question to you is, when you first started doing this, why did you bring this into your teaching, and sort of what was your early experience of response to it?
Well, wanting to teach a class like this was actually the reason that I went to get a doctorate in the first place, because I had been director of a women's center at a university, and mostly women, used the services of that center. And as I got to know them over time, they shared their stories with me. I heard from so many of them who were survivors of domestic violence, incest, um, sexual assault, that they had tried to go to a faith leader to talk about what happened, and over again, and it didn't matter whether they were talking to somebody who was liberal or conservative, over and over again, they got responses and advice that basically sent them back into a war zone and made it their responsibility to change the violence. And as I listened to those stories, I made a commitment to myself that I would do what I needed to do to someday be able to teach a class to future clergy, so that perhaps one day there'd be fewer women and men walking into offices where they received that kind of information. So it was the stories of people who had interacted with various kinds of clergy that just drove home the point for me of how important it is to include something like this in a theological school curriculum.
But why is the role of that person significant? I mean, let me play the devil's advocate. If a victim goes to their priest or rabbi or leader and for help and doesn't get that help, can't she or he go someplace else and get the help they need?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. But let me answer that by telling you about a student that was in one of my classes one year, some years back. She was Roman Catholic, and she had gone to her priest many times during the course of 25 years because of the abuse that she was experiencing from her husband. And over again, the priest told her that marriage was a sacrament, she was bound by it, and she couldn't leave. And she didn't want to choose between her faith and safety, so she went back home. And then a new priest came into her parish, and I don't know how this woman got the courage to once again go and talk to the priest, because of course every time she did so it was very dangerous if her husband were to find out. And this new priest, after he listened to her story, he looked at her and said, the first time he hit you, he broke the marriage covenant and you were no longer bound by it. And she turned to the class and she said, it was like he opened my prison door and I walked through. And no one else could have given her that liberative message that gave her, allowed her to give herself permission to leave that violent home. When a person of her faith told her that she could still be a faithful woman and leave, she was able to get herself safe. That's the difference that I think it is to hear something from one's own faith leader.
And I think, both sides of that story make it very clear how critical it is, because what the first priest did for 25 years was what kept her there.
Right, exactly.
And so even a neutral response might have been more helpful, but the fact that he really doubled down on her in terms of not understanding what she was going through, not supporting her, not helping her to find safety, really kept her in that situation. And then the different approach by the second priest was, 180 degrees what she needed.
Yes,
so the contrast is profound, I think. But we do hear that all the time in terms of, here are the two options basically that we hear clergy doing. And it's the resource and roadblock approach that we consistently run into from communities and faith leaders of either people's faith and religious tradition and practice will be a roadblock to them getting away from the violence and being safe, or it can be a resource. And our job is to get the roadblock out of the way and bring the resources to bear.
Absolutely.
And I think in teaching, in seminary and providing theological education for leadership, we have an opportunity to at least begin the process there and certainly alert students to the fact that you will see this when you get out in ministry, no matter where you are in ministry, which is the other important information that I certainly didn't receive in my seminary training, to expect this and not be surprised. Because literally, whether you're in a hospital chaplaincy, certainly a prison chaplaincy, a local congregation, children's ministry, you know, wherever you are, you will, if you're paying attention, you will encounter both victims and perpetrators.
Right. Well, sometimes when you have the training, then what you see before you, you can understand it as perhaps a result of abuse, whereas someone without the training wouldn't understand that. You know,
Right.
adults with chronic health disease, that often is a factor, a result of childhood trauma, and there are studies now that demonstrate that. So, you know, a minister may be visiting someone with a chronic pulmonary disorder in the hospital and not realize that what they're seeing is the aftermath of trauma. And with some training, they might be able to have a conversation with that person that allows them to share what's happening and therefore help them recover or just become a person that has more support in the community because they can disclose to a pastor they feel is safe to talk to.
It's trying to help people to see what they see.
Yes.
And you really won't see it unless you understand what's behind people's experiences, so that what they share with us then begins to make sense in that larger context.
Yep, that's right.
So let's go to the next slide, please, Sarah. These two more recent studies, I think, are very interesting because they give us some data that's particular to faith communities. The first one, compassionate clergy counseling can have a positive influence. Nancy, talk a little bit about your reaction to that study.
Yeah, one of the very interesting things about this study is that they found that even if the clergy hadn't had specific training in intimate partner violence or sexual assault, if they simply listened attentively and believed what the survivor was telling them, they found these positive psychological outcomes. They didn't have to be experts, but they had to be clergy who didn't belittle or blame or somehow react negatively to the survivor when the survivor was talking to them, and that alone made all the difference.
Which is pretty amazing in terms of not really requiring a lot of expertise to be able to do that.
It is remarkable. It is remarkable that just doing no harm has positive psychological benefits.
Especially given how frequently the opposite happens when somebody discloses that they've been victimized in some way.
Yes, sadly that's true.
So, okay, and then the next one, clergy referred batters to a batterer program. Talk about that one.
Yeah, this is something that is just so powerful and almost hard to believe, but this is the data that they found that when clergy held abusers accountable and did things like say, I will support you in your efforts to change and so forth, and they encouraged them to go to these programs, referred them to these programs, the men were more likely to complete those programs, to graduate from them, than when their attendance was mandated by judges. And when both clergy and judges were holding the men accountable, they were even much more likely to complete the programs. And, you know, a program isn't a cure. It takes a long time for a person to turn around abusive behavior and learn to live in the world in a way where they are not abusive to others. But certainly a certified abuser intervention program, state certified program, is the best chance one has of getting an abuser to change their behavior. So it's huge. Anything we can do to make them compliant, since so many drop out. It's huge. There's one study where they found that something like 95% of the men in the programs they studied were there because they'd been court-ordered. And what that means is that most abusers don't join a program because they want to, because they think it's going to be good for them. Most go because somebody else is holding them accountable. So if we ever want to turn the tide of intimate partner violence, we have to work together and do everything we can to get as many abusers as possible into these programs and completing these programs. And clergy can be huge in this.
And then I think the pastoral role in that process is the support of the person going through the 2 or 3 years that it's going to take, and checking in with them and how's it going and what are you learning and all that kind of stuff, but also consistently giving the message, you know, you have to do this. This is, and again, if it's court mandated, you really have to do it, but it's, and the battered treatment people that I've talked with over the years have been pretty consistent in their experience that the fact that somebody makes them go, that there is some pressure either from the court or from their family perhaps, or from an employer or their faith community, the fact that somebody outside of them is really putting the pressure on them and holding them accountable is the key to the success of their participation. So I think you're absolutely right. When we can combine the legal pressure with the pastoral encouragement, that's, for people of faith, that's a very powerful motivator to hang in there and do the hard work that they have to do. And the other piece of it that often gets forgotten in our faith communities is that, I mean, we have a whole theological framework here that goes unused in terms of the expectation of accountability, the expectation of repentance, the expectation of making right the harm that we've done to another person and taking responsibility for it and so forth. And that's not only an individual process, but it's a communal process within our faith community life together. And I think we don't use that enough. We don't draw on that part of our traditions to say, you know, this is who we are as people of faith, and we're not going to, you know, drive you out of the community. We're not going to isolate you and shun you, but we expect you to step up to this, and we're going to be with you through it. I remember hearing a story a number of years ago from a Catholic parish where it was a predominantly Latino parish, and one of the advocates who was doing a lot of work in that community told about one of the priests who had been very good and very involved and supportive of their work. And she said that their experience was that literally when finally a woman would come forward and disclose what was going on, that when the priest sat down with the abuser and basically said, you may not do this anymore, she said that in and of itself had the biggest impact on the guys that they were working with there. And then they tried to get them into the program so that they would have, you know, the opportunity for more training themselves and, you know, how to live one's life differently. But she said the key to the whole thing was the priest basically said, you may not do this, and part of it rested on the important cultural significance of the leadership of the priests in that community. So, you know, that's not going to work in every community in the same way, but when there is clear respect for the authority of a faith leader, then I think it's a powerful tool in holding people accountable and supporting them in making change and dealing with what we like to call repentance.
Right, absolutely. And it's a profound act of pastoral care when a pastor does hold an abuser accountable too, in that if that doesn't happen, that abuser could go and do something much worse, like kill the partner, wind up in prison forever, which is not good for anybody. So by the pastor having a role in helping that person hold themselves accountable for their behavior, they can prevent far worse tragedies down the road.
Right.
Or at least help prevent. Obviously, only an abuser can stop abuse behavior, so the clergy person is never responsible for what an abuser does. But
right.
studies show us that clergy can have a huge positive role.
Yeah. And, you know, I sure don't want that on my conscience, that it's that whole thing of, you know, knowing and not doing something, not attempting to intervene in some way to be helpful, and then having an outcome like that. You know, I don't want to have to live with that. So it's really, you know, behooves us to do something. And like you say, we may not be able to prevent it, but we are really called to do something.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's go on to talk about the next slide, the teaching that we can do in seminaries and its impact on congregations and culture. As you look back on your teaching, Nancy, over the years around this material, what have you seen in terms of, you know, when your students come back and talk to you and so forth, what have you seen that you feel has been the impact of your teaching?
Well, I'll give you 2 stories from just this past fall here. I was contacted by one of our alumni who had a situation in her church where the next day she was going to have to help a woman leave her abusive home, get out of the home with her children while her husband was away at a church function. And she called me for help because she had never done any work on this and had no idea what to do. So we spent a lot of time on the phone. I sent her a lot of resources, and then, you know, throughout the process, I worked with her and quickly referred her to others in her community who were experts who could guide her, help her know what was coming. But she was frantic. It was an extremely difficult situation for her. She felt completely out of her league. At the same time, I was at a meeting this fall where I met one of our students who is doing a field education placement with a church, and it just so happens that student, she had taken the class, and the pastor of the church had taken the class, and she stopped me and told me about a situation that had come up in their church, and how she and the pastor, because they had done some training, both knew exactly how to react to the situation. They were on the same page. It wasn't easy, but it was seamless compared to what the untrained person had to deal with, and how stressful it was for them. So I think that's a small, recent example of the difference that training makes. And so the congregations benefit because the pastor and the field ed person had done some work with the congregation so that they had some understanding of the issue before it happened in the church, so they could support people in appropriate ways. And in terms of the larger culture, the pastor who didn't have training, I mean, she did a great job relying on the resources made available to her to do the right things in this setting. But one of the things she did was when she went to bring the woman to the shelter, the battered women's shelter, she was told by the staff there, this is like September of 2015 in Massachusetts, she was told by the staff there she was the first clergy person they ever met who came to the shelter for any purpose other than getting the woman to go back home.
Oh, gee.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk about impact on larger culture. It's no wonder that many advocates can view clergy of all kinds with great suspicion because that's their experience, which makes it so critical that people who are trained make themselves known to the advocates, not just so that they can have support from them, but so that the advocates can have support from clergy.
Right.
Now that person is called by the shelter whenever they have someone who's wrestling with issues of faith, because they know she's not going to give them the advice that other pastors have.
Right. So she becomes a trusted resource for the advocates, and that then means that we're actually all working on the same page and for the well-being of the victim or survivor who needs both of us at that point.
Absolutely.
But that's such a, painful story in terms of literally in 2015 that's still the experience in some shelters, and
it breaks your heart.
It's inexcusable at this point. I mean, 40 years ago that was the norm, but that cannot continue.
Right, and that's that's a story I've heard from other students who have reconnected with me after they've graduated, where they've had similar experiences of being the first pastor. That's happened like 3 or 4 times that I've known about, just in this area of Massachusetts in the last 4 years. So so there's a lot of that out there where advocates don't see clergy as a resource, and that's not, clergy can be so powerful, as we've been discussing, and could be so important even for the advocates in their own faith journeys as they interact with this horrific abuse, and could use the kind of community support that can come from a faithful church community. So, there's so many things that could happen that could be positive if clergy were trained and if they were in touch with the advocates and resource people in their communities.
Yeah, and really have relationships to those people and those agencies, so that, like you say, now in that setting, there is an actual clergy person who they know, whom they can call on for help, and vice versa. So, well, let's look at the next slide in terms of, we're sort of starting to think about what are some of the things that should be included in theological education around these issues. And again, in your experience in your classes, what do you think are the critical things that you want your students to take away from their course?
Yeah. Well, I want them to know what the policies are in their own faith tradition. So, they need to know what their denomination or other religious group has said about intimate partner violence, domestic violence, whether they have pronouncements on the websites, how easy are they to find, how good are they, how thorough are they. I want them to have enough knowledge about the issue to be able to make some assessments there. Again, as a way to, when the policies are good, they can be a great resource in helping people understand that the abuse that they're experiencing is not what their church family wants for them. And in fact, there are these official pronouncements condemning this and encouraging people to get safe. This goes right back to our conversation about wanting to make sure people aren't choosing between faith and safety. And I want the graduates of these classes to have done their own homework, their own theological homework, so that they, every tradition has its texts of terror, the kinds of verses that get quoted out to people and make them feel like they have to stay in a unsafe relationship. But every tradition also has wonderful traditions and texts that counteract those messages. So I want my students to be fully prepared, having investigated that and knowing how their own theological stance brings them to a different conclusion about what has to happen when violence destroys a marriage covenant. So I want them to have that kind of information. And I want them to have some practical experience of how to respond. It can be terrifying for anyone to encounter this. The stakes are high, the trauma is huge, the violence is horrific, and I want them to have some practice responding before they have to, so that they will be able to kind of keep their wits about them and be effective. And this may be in the category of shameless promotion, but frankly, I've used the Faith Trust DVD series, the Pastoral Care for Domestic Violence Case Studies for Clergy program in this class for as long as I've been teaching it. And so every class session, They're looking at a case study where a clergy person is talking to either a survivor or an abuser, and we stop the DVD, we talk about what they're doing well, how could they improve, and then as part of that program, they're in triads, and somebody is the pastor, and somebody is enacting an abuser or survivor, and somebody is just observing. And I can't stress enough how powerful it is for them to have to sort of be in the hot seat and test out the material. What comes to mind? What can they draw upon that they've been learning to respond to the different scenarios that are part of that program? It's a perfect training program, but it just sort of underscores how important practical training is.
Well, thank you for that, and we're always glad to hear that the materials are useful. And I think what it gives to the students is it gives them a chance to really be in that situation and realize they can come through it on the other side, and they can be helpful, and they can survive the whole experience and move on. Because
absolutely,
again, like you say, it's a very daunting reality when we begin to hear people's experiences and realize it's like, oh my God, this is way bigger than anything I've ever had to deal with, or know. So I think that's the point where the temptation, and I certainly appreciate it, the temptation is to turn away from that and to not really, to shut that door basically and not really go there with people because we don't feel prepared. I think that's one of the main reasons that clergy don't respond well, is that they don't feel adequately prepared and confident that they can be helpful. I don't think it's because they don't care. But not feeling confident that I have anything to offer here, I think really holds people back from engaging. But it also brings me to the question that I'd be interested in your thoughts of, are we training students in ministry to be generalists around this or to be specialists in this area?
What I hope happens is that they realize who the resources are, what their roles are and aren't, so that they can be the pastors, but they can be pastors who know how to respond in those moments of crisis. So that, because those responses make all the difference on whether someone is going to be safer or not, whether an abuser might be held accountable or not. And I do understand, clergy not wanting to weigh in, perhaps for fear that they might make matters worse because they're not trained, but they don't have to do everything. And that's the beauty of this. If they know enough to know how to respond initially and have made contact with resources in their communities, they become part of a team of people on which they can rely, so that together they can care for the survivor and hold the abuser accountable.
Yeah, but you have to know you've got those people in your
absolutely
on your list and in your relationships to be able to go there and to utilize them.
You have to do some homework before you need to. Yep. And it's also the case that none of us is going to be perfect. We are going to make mistakes. We're going to have somebody leave our office, or we're going to hang up the phone and we're going to realize, oh my gosh, I should have said this, or I should have done that. But, we're human beings. We're not going to be perfect. But we can make such a difference just by doing what we can in the moment. And training, of course, is necessary for that to be able to happen well.
And when we think about the way that theological education is offered at this point, like you're doing a full semester course?
Yes.
Is that how it works?
Yes.
Why do students take that course? I mean, what?
Well, I think one of the things that can be really helpful in terms of getting busy seminarians to take a class like this, especially when people in theological schools aren't necessarily better informed about this issue than anybody else, so they may not realize how important it's going to be to their future ministry. But my course meets one of the core requirements of the school for graduation.
Okay.
And in fact, both in the different degree programs, it meets a requirement in each of these programs. So every year I have students who take the class and sheepishly admit that they don't know anything about it, but the time worked and it met a requirement, so why not? So, and that's okay. That's okay. I'll take them anywhere they come.
That's right. That's right.
But of course, it doesn't take long for that huge aha moment to come, because once you've had a chance to start looking at how prevalent this is, they're sort of like deer in headlights. They had no idea. And of course, we were all there at some point. You don't grow up knowing this intuitively. We all had to learn it at some point and had that same experience of, oh my gosh, how can this be so common and yet so underground?
Right.
How do we miss it?
Right.
So for me, it's been really helpful to have this course be a requirement, and of course or meet a requirement, and of course that couldn't happen if I didn't work with a supportive academic dean and faculty colleagues who, this may not be their thing, but they understand that it's important, and I've had great support at Andover Newton for doing this work. So I've been really fortunate in that way.
Yeah, I think the pieces have all been there for you.
Yes,
to be able to continue to offer this.
Right.
But what about integration into other coursework and the whole multidisciplinary approach? Do you find other colleagues there who are, including things in their courses so after a student goes through your course, when they take Bible or they take preaching or they take ethics, they're going to start to hear some of the same information but from a different discipline?
It's more likely that that happens to some degree, certainly not in all classes. My colleagues who teach pastoral care and some who teach ethics are also aware of this issue, and so it will become part of what gets talked about in the class. It might be one day in the class, or it might be some reading that's part of the class. But as far as I'm concerned, ideally you give people enough time to really get a sense of the breadth and depth of this issue and how to respond, which for me, I think a semester-long class is ideal. But the one thing that's common across seminarians who are going to be clergy or chaplains or in ministry in some way is that they care deeply about being effective for the people they intend to serve. And once they get a taste of this, even if it's a day, they are much more likely to do more investigation on their own because they feel ill-prepared, or then take a class like mine because they realize the issue is out there and they're likely to encounter it. And so, they do care a great deal about being effective, being great pastors. And so once they get introduced to it, even in smaller ways, that motivates them to learn more so that they can do the right thing when they're out there.
Well, that's interesting, and that would actually be interesting to gather some data, like your students, in terms of after they take your course, how does it shape the rest of their time in formal seminary training? In their preaching course, then, do they identify the potential of preaching as a place that they can be proactive and utilize that course to help them think through how they want to preach on these issues? Do they take the initiative to do that because of what you've already taught them?
Yeah, that would be great data to have.
Yeah, it'd just be interesting to try to measure where those students take this after you make them sit down and pay attention to what they're going to see. And but I think the cross-discipline part of theological education at this point is really critical because, again, not everybody's going to take an actual course, a full course.
Yeah, right.
But also there's the intersection with all of the disciplines is so significant in terms of both thinking through the theological understanding as well as the practical, what do we do when? But, I want to see biblical studies And I know there's some folks out there now doing that in their teaching around biblical studies, so that some of the hard texts that they really tackle and help people work through, and then they teach them a methodology that serves them, down the line if they're using the lectionary somewhere else, to be able to preach on and teach on these issues, but from a variety of sources in terms of the sacred texts that they're using.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's very important.
So let's go to these challenges. You talked about the fact that you've had administrative support. What happens when you don't have administrative support?
Yeah, that can make a huge difference. Sometimes the school's administration can see that there might be some value here, but they are not going to be looking for it in a search process. So they might, if the school is fortunate, designate an adjunct to come in and teach something on this, or teach a course that might cover this issue among others. And that sends a positive message. It's a little different message than when you've got somebody who's a regular part of the faculty who's teaching a class like this. And for some people who really want to teach in this area or write in this area, the whole process of tenure and needing to make sure that they get it, and some in the field not seeing research in this area as real research, that can mean that somebody who graduates from a PhD program and is determined to write and teach on this area, they have to postpone doing that until they get through the tenure process, so that they can ensure that they do get through the tenure process. So those things can be roadblocks. And then, of course, you may have an environment where the people who are in the positions that decide who's teaching and what they're teaching are not only uninformed about this, but uninterested. So those things can all make it very difficult for faculty with great intentions to be able to do what they want to do.
Yeah. And you're in an administrative role as well as a teaching role.
Right.
So at this point, you're one of the people that can either make it possible or prevent it from happening, right?
Yeah, so I'm in the conversations and around the table when some of those conversations are held. But for me, again, I've been so fortunate. My colleagues get this, and they understand my passion for it, and they're fully supportive. And that, I think, is a fairly unusual position to be in.
Yeah. A good position to be in, though.
A very good position to be in, yeah.
Because I think it's allowed you to be more effective over time, and really be able to offer something of depth in your teaching.
Well, and in my Dean of Campus Life role, we can have speakers come in or to talk about this topic as part of the non-classroom curriculum. And I've done webinars and continuing education kinds of programs through our continuing education program. And again, I'm in a position to be able to talk with people about why this is important and have them respond positively.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, let's see if we have some comments and questions from folks. Sarah, what do you have for us?
Okay, here I am. Sorry about that. So we have a couple of questions. First, I want to let people know that we have a couple of resources here available, including the 2 surveys that IMA World Health published in the last couple of years. So one question we have is, what are some simple things that faith leaders could be doing right now?
Simple things.
Toolkit.
So here's a few things. One of the things that I do in my home church is I have the National Domestic Violence Hotline number in every single bulletin. And it says, if you or someone you know feels unsafe in a relationship, please call this number for a confidential conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So that way it's safe for somebody to be found with a number, and it sends a signal that the church cares about and realizes that this issue is alive.
Mm-hmm.
So that's simple. Putting
That's
something
great.
on bulletin boards. Marie and I have probably both heard from people for whom they first realized what was happening to them and how wrong it was by picking up a brochure during a church coffee hour that they just saw
Mm-hmm.
laying around.
Mm-hmm.
These are relatively simple things, putting magnets in the men's and women's rooms and any gender-neutral bathrooms that you have in your church. All these things give people a resource number so that they have it at their fingertips, and also convey the message that this church cares about people who might be in a situation like this.
Mm-hmm. I like the idea of putting it in the bulletin because not only does that normalize it, but it's there every week.
Yep.
And like you say, if somebody, if an abuser finds the bulletin with a number in it, it's not quite as, I would hope, as much of a problem as if you've taken a brochure on domestic violence
Right.
from the pile and taken it home and had someone find that. And you've got it in front of you every week. So it's a great reminder to people that there is that resource out there. I like that idea.
Yeah.
I think the preaching piece of it is very important. And
Yes.
again, not once a year is not enough. This should not be the special Sunday, particularly in October, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, for example, or April, Sexual Assault Awareness Month. There's so many opportunities in general in preaching and teaching, and the stories that we share and the examples that we give and the prayers that we pray and so forth. Again, to integrate an awareness that gives the signal clearly to the congregation from the leadership that we know this is part of our community, just like it is of every community. We are available and willing to talk with you about it, and it educates the congregation, so they begin to integrate it into their worldview and begin to see things differently in their families and with their coworkers and so forth.
Yeah, very important. Just including a prayer for survivors as a part of a pastoral care or a chalice lighting, or if you light candles in your congregation or do something else during joys and concerns, to have that be part of the pastor's regular prayer for members of the congregation who are experiencing family violence or intimate partner violence. That again, it normalizes it, and it says this is something we can talk about here. I think people have to remember that the kinds of stories that survivors have to disclose, they feel a great deal of shame around them, and they're not the kinds of things that you normally talk about in church. And it can be very hard in a church setting, because it's a church setting, and because the person you're talking to is a pastor, to disclose some of the horrific things that are happening to you. But if you have a sense that this is something that it's okay to talk about in church, it's going to make it that much easier for a victim or survivor to be able to come forward and feel that they can be safe talking to you.
And I think for clergy, it's a reminder that you will not hear about this unless you speak about it. I mean, that's the paradox. You have to speak about it before people will be comfortable disclosing and really talking about what's going on for them. So and again, we have that opportunity of a public setting of leadership, day in, day out, week in, week out, where we can be the ones that open the door for the conversation. And if nothing else, that we can do that.
Yeah, the number one reason I hear from clergy about why they don't do anything in this area is because they say it doesn't happen in my church. But I've also had the experience of, offering, a friend and I used to do quite a few Saturday seminars for clergy, and they would tell us with some shock that when they announced that the pastor would be out of the office on a such and such a day because they were attending this seminar on domestic violence, suddenly these people in their congregation came out of the woodwork, and they may have been there 15 years and they had no idea they were there.
Right.
But when they say they're going for a session or a seminar like this, suddenly they're perceived as people who will believe the victim's story and perhaps be safe to talk to.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm still stunned that they are surprised by that. But
yeah,
but it's part of what people have to learn about this, and about kind of how communities deal with it and how individuals are able to begin to talk about their experiences and what our role can be in that.
And I
Sarah,
think too.
Go ahead, Nancy.
I was just going to say that it's also important, with some training to talk about this in premarital counseling, to do separate conversations with the partners, potential spouses, and a really practical guide for this is Susan Yarrow Morris's Opening the Door, a pastor's guide to addressing domestic violence and premarital counseling. It's an A to Z of what you need to know to be able to do this well, and that can be a critical way to stop a situation that could deteriorate and become very dangerous.
And at least, give individuals a chance early in their relationship to address the potential for the relationship to really be dangerous and hurtful to both of them. Yes, thank you for mentioning that resource, and that resource is available at Faith Trust Institute. Susan is one of our colleagues that we've worked with for many years on these issues, and has made a great contribution with that book.
Yeah, it's a wonderful resource.
So Sarah, is there something else that we'd like to talk about?
There is. So we have a comment from one of the audience members who is a pastor and a batterer intervention group facilitator. And he wanted, or she wanted to underline what you said, that the church can be a great friend to the programs because completion of the program is key to making change. And along those lines, making friends with your advocates, making friends with your shelter providers, making friends with all of those, and your batterer intervention groups, important.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have a question about is understanding how to talk about how Scripture is misused one of the first steps that students need?
I think it's helpful for students to understand where Scripture comes from so that they can identify when it's being misused, regardless of whether we're talking about domestic violence or racist attitudes or gender sexism, that sort of thing, to have a sense of Scripture in context. There's a wonderful part of a sermon that I read just recently from one of my students where he was talking about Ephesians 5 and the verse that says, wives have to submit to husbands. And so he said, what if you're seeing a jaguar on a piece of paper, a drawing paper, and it looks like it's coming right at you. It's very realistic. Its teeth are bared, the eyes are huge, the claws, it's just moving toward you. And then you turn the page and you see the rest of the picture, and you realize the jaguar isn't coming at you, but there's a group of hunters in the background that is coming after it. And what you're seeing is the fear as it tries to get away. It puts the whole thing in context. And with Scripture, if you take one verse and use it as a battering ram, you can make Scripture say a whole lot of things. But hopefully a theological education helps you understand how to put it in its historical and theological context so that you disarm those texts of terror from being used in the ways that many have been used.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's probably the most valuable thing about theological education in all of our faith traditions is to the discipline of learning enough about our sacred texts and where they came from and what they meant both in context historically but also how they are used now.
Right.
And then to be able to correct some of the misuse and to also equip our people to their own critical thinking about the study of text, and that they, they have the capacity to say, wait a minute, this doesn't work for me. I don't understand why this is this way, and where did this come from, and how it's been misused in the past, and is there any alternative way to understand this, like you were just describing, Nancy. So I think we both, as we train our students in seminaries, but also that we are training them to be those teachers out there in congregations who bring that same message of critical thinking about text, and really equipping our people to be adults, and adult, faithful people, but based on knowledge and understanding and not on ignorance, is absolutely critical for our work on this issue.
Absolutely.
Well, are we to our end time?
We are to our
We
end
might
time.
be.
Yes. So I want.
Okay. Well, thank you, Nancy, for being in this conversation with me. I've certainly enjoyed it, and we will continue it, of course, at other times. But
Great.
thank you for taking your time to help us bring this conversation forward. Sarah?
My pleasure.
Okay, so I want to thank Nancy and Marie for doing this presentation today. Obviously, there's a lot more that could be said. We want to thank the In Faith Community Foundation for their sponsorship of today's conversation. I know that we didn't get to all of your questions. If you have a pressing question that needs an answer, you can email that to me and I will try to help you with a response. When you close the webinar window in just a couple of minutes, you'll be asked to fill out a survey, and we would be very grateful if you would give us your feedback on this presentation or ideas for future presentations. You can view our upcoming webinars on faithtrustinstitute.org. We have a webinar in January on human trafficking and the role of the faith community, so hopefully you can join us for that. This concludes today's presentation. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will send you a PDF of the slides later this afternoon. Thank you so much. Have a good day.